All right, diving in today, folks. We're tackling a giant, Hugo Grotius, 17th century, huge in philosophy, political theory, law, you name it.
Yeah, a big name. Still, even now, if you're into philosophy, you've probably run into him, especially his natural law stuff.
That's our target today. This deep dive is all about Grotius, his core ideas, really getting into normativity, rights, all that good stuff, and even, get this, justification for war.
Oh, yeah. He had a lot to say about that.
And, just a little teaser, the guy's life, wild, prison breaks, politics, shipwrecks, it's a story.
Sounds like it.
So, thinking like a philosopher here, why should we even care about some guy from way back when? What makes Grotius matter now?
Good question. Well, for starters, when you dig into Grotius's work, you'll notice right away he's always referencing tons of thinkers, like from all over history. You got your ancient philosophers and historians, poets, orators, the whole shebang.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading Rousseau wasn't a fan. He said Grotius relies on the poets, something like that.
Right, right. And Grotius himself, he actually talks about it in De Jure Belli Ac Pacis. He's like, all these great minds agreeing, got to be some universal truth there.
Interesting. So, for us philosophers, always looking for that clear argument, this whole historical name-dropping thing, kind of weird, right? What's the deal with that?
Well, there are a couple ways to look at it. One is this idea of Philosophia Perennis.
Yeah.
This idea that there are certain truths that keep popping up throughout history, like in all the great thinkers. Like there's this thread of wisdom.
Yeah, the timeless truths kind of deal. Okay.
Exactly. Grotius seems to be saying, look, I'm not just pulling this stuff out of thin air. All these smart folks across time, they've been saying similar things. There's got to be something to it. He saw himself as kind of bringing it all together,
So he's building this historical consensus to make his argument stronger? Clever.
Yeah.
But you mentioned there was another reason.
Right, right. So the other thing is Grotius was trying to fight against skepticism, especially about international law. Like, does it even exist? Does it actually work?
Yeah, that's always a tough one, even now.
Right. And supposedly he was really bothered by this quote from Cardinal Richelieu, that cynical line, "The weakest are always wrong in matters of state."
Oof, yeah. Realpolitik at its finest.
Exactly. So Grotius is basically saying, hey, look, it's not just me making this stuff up. All these important people throughout history, they've recognized these rules, these norms that govern how we interact. It's like a mountain of evidence,
I get it. It's like saying, see, this isn't just some theoretical fluff. This has roots, deep roots. But there's another thing about Grotius, how he looks at ethics, politics, law. It's different from how a lot of us do it now, right?
Right, yeah. He doesn't really separate them out, into neat little boxes.
Not compartmentalized like we tend to do these days.
Exactly. So for him, there are differences between legal norms, moral norms, political norms, sure. But he thinks they're all connected. They all come from these deeper principles, these principles of normativity that are rooted in nature.
So it's like this integrated system. Ethics, politics, law, they all kind of flow together.
Exactly. And for a philosopher, I think that's really important to understand. Grotius isn't just interested in one little piece of the puzzle. He's trying to figure out the big picture, the fundamental principles that underlie all normativity.
And speaking of big pictures, that brings us to the heart of it. His natural law theory.
Ah, yes. Natural law. Just saying those words, it's like opening up this whole can of philosophical worms.
Right. As philosophers, we know natural law, there's so much to unpack there, so many different ideas.
Oh, yeah, tons. It's incredibly complex. It can be about describing how the world is or about what we ought to do. It can be about the structure of societies or about individual morality. And then what does natural even mean? What does law even mean? It's a whole thing.
So, Aquinas, obviously, big name in natural law. Where does Grotius fit into all of this? What's his take on where natural law comes from?
That's actually, that's really interesting because his thinking kind of evolves,
Oh.
Yeah, in his earlier work, the Euripide, he's very much like God's will is law, end of story. So natural law is like straight from God's command. But then later on, in his more famous book, De Jure Belli Ac Pacis, he shifts. It's a big shift. He's like, no, actually, natural law comes from human nature itself.
Wow, that's a big jump. So instead of God saying, this is the law, it's more like humans are like this, so the law should be like this.
Yeah, exactly. And he has this famous line, the mother of right, that is, of natural law, is human nature.
Powerful stuff. And, for philosophers, that's huge. Because now you're grounding law not just in what God says, but in something that's inherent to being human.
Totally.
And, that etiam si duremus bit, even if we should concede that there is no God, whoa, That's radical for his time.
Uh,
He's opening the door to ethics and law that don't need God as the foundation.
Yeah, it's like he's laying the groundwork for secular thought in a way, and it's still relevant today. We're
mhm.
still talking about human rights, universal values, all that, even without bringing religion into it.
Right, right. So for Grotius, by de jure belli ac pacis, natural law, it's all about right reason, right? What's in line with our rational nature, our social nature?
Yes.
The law.
That's the idea. He's saying, we're rational beings, we're social beings, and the law of nature reflects that. If something goes against that, then it's not permissible. It's like a descriptive view might say, well, humans naturally try to stay alive, right?
Oh.
But a prescriptive view from that same starting point, it would say, okay, therefore we should act in ways that preserve life, our own and others. And then natural, that could mean our human nature, or it could mean some bigger cosmic order. Grotius is more focused on human nature, especially in his later work.
All right, so we've got natural law coming from human nature, right, a reason, all that. But how do we actually figure out what this law is? What are the big principles for Grotius?
Well, he thought, we got to study human nature, really understand what makes us tick, what are our basic drives. And for him, there are two big ones, self-preservation and the need for society. We want to stay alive, but we also need each other.
Makes sense. Those seem pretty fundamental.
Right. And he sees them as kind of balancing each other out. Like, we don't just run around doing whatever we want because we're also social creatures. We have to consider others.
We can't just be completely selfish.
Exactly. And on the flip side, our need for connection, it's limited by our need to, survive, to take care of ourselves. So he's got these fundamental drives. And from there, he comes up with some key principles. Like the first two he really emphasizes are don't take what belongs to others and keep your promises.
Oh, yeah, pretty basic stuff, but fundamental.
Right. It's like even without any fancy legal systems, we kind of get this on a gut level. You don't just steal people's stuff and you should honor your commitments. It's just basic social interaction. He also talks about correcting wrongs and punishing those who deserve it. Actually, in his earlier work, De Jure Pride, he even lists out like 22 basic principles. It's a lot.
So Grotius, he's all about figuring out these first-order principles, the building blocks of natural law. But moving on, he also has some interesting ideas about Orpheus, rights.
Yes, and his take on Orpheus is really important and has had a huge influence on political thought.
Right.
So for him, Orpheus, it's a moral quality of a person. It's what makes it okay morally and legally for you to have or do something. It's a power, it's something inherent to you as an individual.
So, I have the right to free speech. That means I have this inherent power to speak my mind, and nobody can, morally or legally stop me.
Exactly. It's a capacity you possess. And the whole focus on the individual, that's why we call his view a subjective rights theory. It's about the powers that individuals have.
Okay, makes sense. But now, for a philosopher who knows a bit about political theory, how is that different from, say, how people thought about rights before Grotius?
Well, the traditional view, the one you see a lot in medieval philosophy, and Aquinas is a big part of this, it's more focused on the object of the right, like the just thing itself. Rights are kind of built into the order of things, the way the world is supposed to be. They're not primarily seen as powers that individuals have.
Interesting. So it's not so much about me having the right, it's about the rightness of the thing itself.
Right. Suarez, he's kind of in between, but Grotius really shifts the focus to the individual, the subject who holds the right. And it's a big shift. It changes how we think about the whole relationship between individuals and, say, the state.
Gotcha. So moving from what's just to what powers do I have?
Yeah, exactly. And this new way of looking at rights, it has some big consequences. For one thing, it creates a sharper line between rights and duties. If my right is a power I have, then your duty is to respect that power.
Right. It's like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. And another thing is Grotius sees rights kind of like possessions, like I can have a right, I can use it, and I can even give it up, transfer it to someone else.
Like selling your car.
Kind of, yeah. And this becomes really important in his political philosophy, especially when he talks about sovereignty.
Oh, right. Sovereignty. Wasn't he pretty controversial on that front? He basically said people can, give up their freedom, right?
Yeah, that was a big one and definitely controversial. He argued that, look, if we can give up our right to our labor, if we can work for someone else, then we should also be able to give up our right to govern ourselves, like transfer that right to a ruler. He thought this was a way to create peace and stability by having a clear authority figure.
Yeah, stability through giving up power.
But, from our perspective now, it's like, whoa, hold on. Can you really just give up your freedom like that? Are there some rights that are just, inherent, inalienable? Thinkers like Rousseau, they really pushed back against this idea. They said, no way, you can't just give up your basic freedom. And it's a debate that's still going on today. What rights are truly fundamental? Can we ever really give them up?
Deep questions. But if people can transfer their power, like Groucho says, where does that power even come from in the first place? Like, it's not just God saying you're in charge, right?
Right. He doesn't totally dismiss those older ideas like divine right of kings or just raw power. But his main argument is the state's power, it comes from us, the people. We agree collectively to give up some of our individual rights, and that's how the state gets its authority. It's like an early form of social contract theory, although not as developed as you see later on with Hobbes and Locke and all that.
So Grotius is saying power to the people, but then the people can kind of give that power away to create a
Yeah,
government.
exactly. It's like individuals coming together and saying, look, we need some rules, we need some structure, so let's create this thing, this state, and give it the power to keep things running smoothly. Now, let's shift gears a bit. Grotius is also super famous for his work on just war theory. Specifically, he's known for this distinction between undimus ad bellum and adinus in bello.
Oh yeah, adinus ad bellum, adimus in bello. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So, Tedius ad bellum, that's all about the right to go to war. Like, when is it morally and legally okay to start a war? What are the justifications?
Right, right.
And then Dineus in bello, that's about the right conduct in war. So, once the fighting has started, how should you behave? What are the rules, even in the middle of a war?
Okay, I'm following. So first, is it even okay to start fighting? And second, once you're fighting, what are the rules of the game?
Exactly.
All right, so let's start with adimus ad bellum. When did Grotius think it was okay to go to war?
Well, his basic argument is that war can be lawful, even morally necessary. And this goes for natural law, international law, and divine law. His reasoning is if you want something, if you have a legitimate goal, then you also got to be willing to use the necessary means to achieve it. So if war is necessary to, say, protect yourself from an attacker, then it's justified.
Makes sense. You got to do what you got to do.
Ah, right. And he lists a bunch of just causes for war, self-defense, obviously, but also recovering what's been unjustly taken, punishing those who've broken the law, defending your state and its citizens. He even says where judicial settlement fails, war begins. Like it's a last resort when everything else has failed.
So for Grotius, war wasn't like inherently evil. It was a tool to achieve justice. And, thinking about what he said about exhausting all other options before going to war, it makes me wonder, what would he say about all the conflicts going on in the world today? It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, for sure. But Grotius, even though he lays out these just causes, he also puts some limits on them. Some of them are a bit controversial.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, for example, he says that you might not have the right to defend yourself if the person attacking you is, quote, useful to many.
Hold on, what? So if someone's like super valuable to society, they can just attack me and I can't fight back.
Well, it's more nuanced than that. It's about extreme cases where the greater good might outweigh the right to self-defense, even for individuals. But yeah, it definitely raises some tough questions. Like, how do we weigh the value of one life against the good of the whole community?
That's a tough one. Okay, so Direcus ad bellum, when to fight, lots to consider there. What about Gudugus in bello? How did Grotius think wars should be fought, ethically speaking?
Right. So with Itius in bello, his main point is even in a just war, you got to be proportionate. The force you use, it can't be more than what's necessary to achieve your goal. And you got to avoid harming civilians as much as possible. His general rule is in war, things which are necessary to attain the end in view are permissible.
Okay, so if it's necessary to win, it's allowed. But I'm guessing necessary can be a slippery word.
Oh, absolutely. He's very clear that you shouldn't interpret necessity too broadly. And then he goes into all these details about specific actions in war. Like, what about using tricks? What about lying to your enemy? What about taking prisoners? He tries to figure out, what's morally okay, what's legally okay, and what crosses the line.
So trying to establish some rules, some ethical boundaries, even in the chaos of war.
Exactly. Because he truly believed that even in war, there are still rules, there are still principles of right and wrong.
Wow. Trying to bring some order to the most chaotic thing there is.
Right. He didn't think that just because it's war, anything goes. He still thought that natural law and the law of nations, they still had to apply. They still had to guide people's actions.
Okay, I'm getting a much deeper picture of Grotius now. But stepping back for a second, thinking like philosophers here, There's always this question about originality. Was Grotius really a groundbreaking thinker, or was he more like taking older ideas and putting them together in a new way?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And scholars are still debating it. Some people, like Irwin, they say, look, in terms of ethics, Grotius wasn't really doing anything totally new. He was building on what Aquinas and Suarez had already said. But then you have others like Schneewand who give him credit for introducing this idea of agonism into ethics. And Dontrev, he argued that it was more about Grotius's method, how he went about building his system of law. It wasn't so much about the specific content, but about his approach, trying to create something that could work for everyone. Even in a time when religion was dividing people, he was moving towards this more secular foundation for natural law. So yeah, it depends on who you ask and what part of his work you're looking at.
So it's not like he came up with everything from scratch, but he definitely put his own spin on things, and his emphasis on certain ideas was unique.
Definitely.
What about in political theory and international relations?
Well, in political theory, some people see his ideas as just, the next logical step from what came before. But a lot of scholars point to how he organized just belly, the whole just war thing, or around natural law principles. That was a big deal. And then in international relations, there's this whole school of thought called Grotian theory, which says that states, they exist in this international society, and there are norms that govern how they interact, and those norms are based in natural law. But at the same time, states are also driven by power, by real politic. So it's this middle ground between idealism and realism.
Ah, so Gorge is trying to find that
Yeah.
balance, ideals and reality.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And whether he was totally original or not, his influence is huge. I mean, kings and philosophers, they were all reading him, talking about him, arguing with him.
Right, right. Wasn't there some Swedish king who carried de jure Belliac posses around with him on military campaigns?
Yeah, King Gustav Adolf, supposedly. And then you have all these big names, Bale, Leibniz, Reed, even Hume. They were all influenced by Grotius in different ways. Even the ones who criticized him, like Rousseau, they were still engaging with his ideas. He was like the guy to talk about, the guy to argue with.
He was setting the terms of the debate.
Yeah, exactly.
So, wrapping things up here, Hugo Grotius, complex dude, blend of old and new. He tackled these huge questions about law, morality, politics, war, questions that are still relevant for us today. He wasn't just some historical footnote. His ideas, they shaped how we think about these things, even now.
Absolutely. And for all you philosophy fans out there, I think Grotius gives you a lot to chew on. He gives you this framework for thinking about where our values come from, what our rights are, how we should act, even in the toughest situations. And his whole idea of grounding law and morality in human nature, even though people still debate it, it's still super relevant today.
It's the foundation for a lot of modern ethical and political thinking.
For sure.
And remember that Etiamsi de Remus thing, ethics and law. Even without God. That's a big one, and it raises some really interesting questions. Like, if we're not relying on divine commands, what does ground our values? How do we build a system of ethics and law in a potentially secular world? And then Grotius's whole thing about individual rights, but also the possibility of transferring those rights. That's relevant to all kinds of debates going on now about the power of the state, individual freedom, all that stuff.
Definitely a lot to unpack there.
Grotius gives us a lot to think about, even centuries later.
I encourage everyone to check out his work, see what you think. And there's tons of great scholarship out there, too, if you want to go even deeper. He's a rich source of ideas for anyone interested in law, morality, politics, all those big questions.
Great stuff. Grotius, a deep dive well worth taking.
Absolutely.